all about fun, right? Finding new things that we love, sharing them with each other, and putting ourselves through the unnecessary stress of ranking things in an arbitrary way so that we can show each other just how much we loved those things that we found. All of this by way of saying this is going to be my top 10 thrillers of all time video that you guys have been asking and asking and asking and asking for, and I have just kept putting off because it's stressful. The numbers and the positioning, and it's all unnecessarily stressful, but I'm gonna do it for you. And you know what? I think some of the answers are gonna surprise you. I don't think you're gonna see some of this coming. So yes, here we are. If I have a tiny mentee bee during this, you only have yourself to blame. Roll the intro. It's Leanne and welcome back to another video. Yes, it is indeed that time. It is time for an updated list of my top 10 thrillers of all time. Top 10 thrillers that I have ever read. And I do think there are a few in the list today that you guys are not going to be expecting. But for those of you who are playing Leanne Bingo down in the comments, let me know how many out of 10 you managed to guess and whether you managed to rank them in the correct order. Because I also think the order's going to be interesting. Because when I sat down to do my little arbitrary 1 to 10 after the first few almost panic attacks and the sweat, I then realised that some things have moved around a whole lot and some things have moved up, because genuinely there are some books that I think just endure with you, and the more and more you think about them, the more and more it kind of like enriches your experience of the book. So yes, that is our plan for today. And before we do that, I do have some thoughts on thrillers and the frequency with which I pick thrillers up. But before we get into that, let us first talk about the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and app where you can learn computer science, statistics and maths. You know that big M word that I've never quite made not the villain of my story? With Brilliant, you could learn how to turn your book collection into statistics. How often do you read a certain kind of book, and how likely are you to rate it 5 stars? What is your average star rating, and could you be doing better? What is the probability that your current formula for picking books is going to give you more 5 stars before the end of the year? And all of this has been made easy and fun to learn with Brilliant, because Brilliant uses the principle of active learning by giving you fun, interactive, colourful content and real-time puzzles to solve. You get invested in the things that you are learning, and then you're more likely to retain them and build on them. Brilliant add new lessons literally every week, so no matter what kind of level of knowledge you come to them with, they're going to be able to take it to the next level. And as well as active learning, they've gamified the experience, so as well as learning, you're going to be getting experience points and unlocking new bonuses. And I don't know about you, but that kind of like incentive based learning really works for me. It really gets me coming back time and time again. So if you would like to try everything that Brilliant has to offer free for 30 days, then follow my link below at brilliant.org/literary-diversions. And the first 200 of you to click on my link will get 20% off Brilliant's premium annual membership. Come and feel brainier with me today and turn even more of your hobby into counting. So 2 things occurred to me when I sat down to write the list for this video. And the first of those things is that I am picking up far less thrillers than I ever have in previous years. Now you guys know that I have always been a fantasy reader at heart, and I will always come back to fantasy, but I read across a huge wide range of genres. And while all of those other genres have kind of waxed and waned in the background, and some of them have just gone away for good, like crime, thrillers like fantasy have been one of the genres that I've kept coming back to over the years. And I've been trying to work out what it is that's put me off thrillers in the last little while. Because let's be honest, despite the slightly unstable mental state that I live in from day to day, it's not like I'm consuming less dark things. I think it's fair to say that like 97.2% of my stuff is dark things. But I am more and more finding myself drifting away from thrillers as a genre. And I came to a couple of conclusions. The first of those conclusions is just oversaturation. Thrillers in the last couple of years have had quite a big resurgence, but unfortunately the recent wave of thrillers has proved out that old thing in publishing where tried and tested is best. And that's because publishers look at trends, they look at what's selling, they look at what was popular, and then they commission or actively seek more of the same thing. What is it that Shay says in that confessional? I could throw a stone and I could hit like 8 other girls that do what she does. It was true then, and it's true now. So yeah, the oversaturation, but the other thing that has put me off more in the past few years picking up thrillers is thrillers just blatantly being mismarketed. Picking up a thriller which is actually more a domestic drama which includes murder, or picking up a thriller and discovering that it has supernatural elements in it and the twist is that, oh, it was actually like a ghost or a demon or whatever. And I can't stand it. I can't stand it. It drives me potty bonkers. But as I was writing this list, I found that another phenomena was happening, and that's that books that I initially thought were going to be on this list were not making the cut. And some other books that I wasn't sure were going to stick around, really have, and they've floated to the top of the pack. In some cases, I even have favourite authors whose previous favourite books are now not my favourite book from them. I'm very interested to see whether you guys are able to guess the books on this list. So without further ado, let's get going. So starting out, coming in at number 10, we have the only YA book to make this list, and that is Sadie by Courtney Summers. So this really is a case of a book enduring, because Sadie was published in 2018, I read it early in 2019, and it has just never left me. There is an indelible mark on my soul, and it is Sadie shaped. And that is for a lot of reasons. First of all, because Sadie is one of the first books to use the podcast trope, but Sadie also left me with the kind of like grim grit and determination of female protagonists that I have loved again and again and again in thrillers. So this book is about Sadie, or rather it's about the story of Sadie, the memory of Sadie, because Sadie was a girl who'd had a particularly difficult life. She had essentially brought up her little sister herself in a trailer park, and she would do anything, give anything to make sure that Mattie got the kind of life that she wanted. But then Mattie went missing and was found dead. And Sadie just absolutely refuses, point blank, to take any of the explanations of police or bystanders or anybody else at face value. She's like, I know my sister, I know what she would do. And so she goes out to not only investigate, but to kind of avenge. But the problem is that Sadie herself then goes missing, and now years and years later we are with a podcast host who overhears Sadie's story and then becomes absolutely obsessed with the idea of finding her, of finding out what happened to her. And so it's very much like a serial podcast where you're starting from the end of the story and trying to work back to work out what exactly happened. Sadie includes quite a few of the tropes that I love dearly. Firstly, we have an extremely unreliable narrator, not only in Sadie but in all of the other people who pop in to give interviews along the way. Secondly, we have that unconventional format. And then lastly, we have got that kind of like echo of small towns. And this book does that so very well. It really investigates this idea of the way that our consciousness is gripped by young blonde girls going missing. The emotional sweeps that this book took me through, it absolutely destroyed me, and it so deserves its place on this list. Okay, so coming back to that idea of unconventional formats, coming in at number 9 we have, you guessed it, The Appeal by Janice Hallett. Now Janice Hallett is very much a new favourite thriller author for me, and I think it's fair to say that she does have one foot also in mystery. The protagonists of Janice Hallett's novels are not characters that you would necessarily expect to see as a main character in a thriller, and actually that's one of the tropes that I love the most. I love when the people in the middle of a case, solving a case essentially, are not really meant to be there. They don't have the skills to do this, but they have either no choice or like this deep and abiding morbid fascination with finding out the truth. So like I say, The Appeal does carry on my love for unconventional formats, because The Appeal is about essentially a small group of amateur dramatics people who are putting on a play in a small English village, and you get all of the attitudes and all of the types of people that you expect to find in a small English village very much caricatured to you. And because they are initially like caricatures of real people, you're like, oh, ha ha ha, that's really funny. And then as you get further involved in these characters, you're like, oh, these people are not harmless, and I underestimated you big time, and I underestimated what spite and nosiness could do big time. And I loved it. It was so juicy and delicious. So as they're putting on this play, two things kind of happen. First of all, one of the little girls who belongs to one of the cast members is diagnosed with quite a rare illness, and they start raising money for her, which is the appeal. And then subsequent to that, somebody is murdered. Now the unconventional format comes in the form of a legal document. So you take the place of two like trainee lawyers who have been handed this case. There is somebody already in jail for this. I do not think that they did it. What do you think? But as much as I'm like, oh, it was funny and it was tongue-in-cheek and you're like, oh god, that's that person, it was also like deeply engrossing and a little bit horrifying, because these people, these kinds of people do exist in our world around us. Like, they are the people in our streets and in our community centres and things like that. They are very much these sweet little people that you see and you really do think, oh, everything's fine, and it's not fine. There was something like weirdly insidious about that, where the more you were going on in the pages, the more you were becoming one of those like nosy people who wanted to know all of the things. It was just so smart. And if you're looking for something which is chunky but the pages fly by in, then pick this one up, because both The Appeal and Alperton Angels I read in like 2 days. Like, gone. So coming in at number 8 is actually a book that I wish that I hadn't listened to on audiobook, because the narrator does such a good job of it that when I close my eyes I can still hear them narrating the book, and I can still hear the pain in their voice coming from those characters, and it hurt me. Like, it hurt me really, really deeply, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm over it, if I'm going to be honest. So that book is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. And this one is a very unconventional thriller. It's unlike anything that I have ever read before. I read it for my Patreon book club, and I'm so glad that I did, because I don't honestly know with this cover when otherwise I would have prioritised this. Characters in this thriller are very much not the characters that you expect to be at the forefront of a thriller. In fact, the plot of this you could pretty much transmute into a crime novel if you just gave it to a detective character rather than the people who are actually at the centre of this. And I think that that is the important thing in this, is who the narrators are. So we start out with a man called Ike Randolph. He is a black man, and he has been out of jail for a number of years at this point, but he very much keeps his head down, because he knows that with a record and being black in the area that he's in especially, he really can't afford to step a toe out of line. So when cops turn up at his door, he's initially like, crap, what have I done? Or what has somebody said that I've done? Or is it just that I'm black? But then those officers go on to tell Ike that his son Isaiah has been murdered, and not only Isaiah, but his white husband Derek. Ike doesn't know what to do with this loss. He's absolutely reeling with it. He can't pull himself together. But then he crosses paths with Derek's father. So Derek's father, Buddy Lee, was pretty ashamed of the fact that Derek was gay and was quite vocal about that. And Derek was quite vocal about the fact that Buddy Lee being a criminal was worse than him being gay. But Buddy Lee is very happy that he does what he does at this point, because he has contacts, and he wants to use those contacts to find out who killed their children. And he's pretty much going to stop at nothing until he does that. And he takes Ike along for the ride. And although this one is a thriller, and although their investigation is like a massive part of this book, a larger part of this book is these two men getting to know each other. These two men from completely different backgrounds, both racially and also just in their personal lives, have no choice but to work together. And as they talk and as they pick apart the things that they've done wrong in the past and things that they wish that they could have done better, and the things that they now looking back on it are like, those were the important things, I wish I could take that back but there is no more time. Those are the things that are important about this book, and there's just such depth of feeling in this book, and I didn't think I was going to come to love these characters as much as I did. I don't know, this one just did things to me, but really it deserves the rave reviews that it got, and I don't know how it's fallen through the cracks. Like, nobody's talking about it now and I'm like, why not? It's so freaking good. Next up we have one that I would put in my oldie but a goldie camp. And when I say oldie, it's only oldie in terms of the rest of the books on this list. It was published in 2009 and I don't really want to do the maths on that at the moment, so we're just gonna keep swimming, you know, far away from that number. And this is one of those thrillers where the thriller author is like massively popular. Like one of those authors that can genuinely bring out a book every 10 years and you're just happy to see something from them. This author has had 2 movie adaptations and like an HBO show, I think, in total from their books. And for some reason, this book is the one that nobody remembers, and it's also the one that got the crappiest adaptation. Like, this book got done so dirty. It deserves its own like Netflix show or something so that you can really experience it over time. But that book is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. Now, as Gillian Flynn goes, I absolutely detest Gone Girl. I hate that book. I adore Sharp Objects, and I think that the adaptation of it is perfect. It perfectly captures everything about that book, but none of them have had as big an effect on me as Dark Places. So Dark Places is about Libby Day. She now pretty much exists on these scraps of money that come in from like a fan club fund that was set up for her when she was a little girl, because when she was a little girl she witnessed the brutal massacre of her entire family and she escaped only just on foot in the snow. Of course, people got obsessed with the story. They sent her money, they set up funds for her, but those funds are rapidly running out and she's not that cute little girl anymore. So when she gets a request to come and speak at a true crime convention and she's told that she's going to be paid and she's told how much she's going to be paid, she can't really afford to turn it down the way that she has all of the other press and interviews. But when she gets there, she does not expect what she gets, which is a fairly placid, fairly nice group of people who are into true crime but who don't believe the story that she gave back then and don't believe that her brother Ben should be in prison for the murders. They believe that she was a little girl who didn't understand what she saw. And with their repositioning and reimagining of the case, Libby starts to then have like memory unlocks where she starts looking at a memory and it's like a kaleidoscope. It changes a little bit. And there's just something different about it which implies something other than what she thought at the time. And the thing that I love about this is that Libby's not a likeable person. She's not a good person. She says it herself, she doesn't want to work, she doesn't want to exist outside of this little bubble that she's made for herself, and she thinks that people should pay her to stay in that bubble because something really horrible happened to her. There's a lot of things that are like bitterly and desperately flawed about Libby, and yet I absolutely loved her. By the midway point of this book, I would quite gladly have gone to bat for her and I would have taken her out of that situation, and I just would be so mad at anybody who said anything bad to her. And the way that this case unfolds, and this one is just better than a whole host of other thrillers that have been dangled under my nose. Next up we encounter another one of my favourite tropes. Coming in at number 6, we have a book that has a creepy child protagonist. Now when I say a creepy child protagonist, I don't mean a YA book. Like I say, there was only one YA book on this list. I mean an adult novel told from an adult point of view with an adult voice that features a creepy child protagonist. And that is very much this book. This is The First Day of Spring by Nancy Tucker, a thriller which I literally let out an audible exclamation like I squealed. People turned and looked at me in Blackwells when I saw this author's name on this book, because I have been following Nancy Tucker for her entire writing career, and that sounds creepy, but it's not, okay? Nancy Tucker initially wrote a memoir about her battle with anorexia over her teenage years, and it was so transforming and transportative, and like the writing in it was just something else, like otherworldly something else. And then after that, as a person in college, she then brought out a book about women who had severe mental health difficulties, but nobody had ever picked up on that. And I bring both of these up not just to tell you about them and to be like, I was a fan before it was cool, but also because that person who Nancy is, somebody who's gone through mental health services herself and then in college has learned a lot about mental health services, that person is now working as a mental health service worker in the social services industry, and this book is actually about a child who is taken into the social services industry, and all of that experience is so woven into this book. It's so real, it's disturbingly real. Like, at points I wanted to stop reading because I was like, this feels like I'm reading a true crime, and if so, I don't want to, because it was horrible. And by horrible, I don't mean there's like massive graphic violence in here, I just mean that the actual subject of it was so like that I had to sit with it for a little while. So the first day of spring is about Chrissy. We meet her in possibly her darkest, but for her, her best moment ever, when she has, as a very small child, just killed another very small child. She's glad that she's done it because now she has a secret that's only her own. She has something that only she knows. Hi. You okay? Hi. Hello. Oh, I'm just a bridge. Okay. Well, I'm glad as always to be of service to you. Chrissy is delighted by the feeling that this murder gave her, with the power and the certainty that she was the only one who could do anything about it. The book is then told in two separate timelines, where we follow Chrissy immediately after the murder as people discover the body and her community kind of goes to pieces, and then a woman in the present day whose name we are not given, but who has a little daughter of her own and who is avoiding phone calls, like assiduously avoiding picking up the phone in case it is some sort of social service worker. And as the two timelines rub up against each other, and as we realise who that person is from the initial story in the present day, just so sad. There's so many sad things about this book, and it's just so clever. The reveals in this are so clever. For a book that feels so obvious almost when you first walk into it, it's a child who's killed another child, you then see so many layers come off of it as the wheels come off the situation, and it's just so good. And Nancy Tucker's writing is just so good. Honestly, when I read this, I would not shut up about it. I gave it to everybody. I made everybody read it, and I still feel like that now. I still feel right now like I should reread it right now. Next up, coming in at number 5, is another incredibly unique thriller, a thriller that I have again never seen replicated anywhere else. I've never seen anybody do the things that this author did, and it is also another trope that I love particularly, not just in thrillers actually, but in books in general, where it is a book that is told over a very specific timeline. In this case, it is told over 3 hours, and you guessed it, that book is 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton. This was a thriller which sat on my shelf for quite a few years before I decided to pick it up, and then when I did, I was like, what is wrong with you? Literally, what is your problem? Why did you not at least read the first couple of chapters? It took me so little time to read this book. You could not speak to me, you could not take it out of my hand. I did not want to touch my phone, I did not want to speak to people. I just wanted to read this book. 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton is kind of, at its very essence, about a school shooting. But it's unique for a lot of different reasons. That school shooting is actually taking place in England for a start. And in the UK, we have very, very strict laws on gun control. And so school shootings are not a thing here. The fact that this is a school shooting in the UK just lends such weight to this narrative, because you're constantly spending all of your time going, but how could this happen? Why is this happening? And that's the exact same feeling that every single one of the characters are echoing back to you in this book, which makes it all the more kind of trippy. And in this book we are following various different people. Sometimes we're following the students who are in the school, sometimes we're following the faculty who are in the school. We are following family members who have been taken to a safe place to be told whether or not their kids have made it, and we're also following a detective who is in charge of the scene. That's one of the things that I actually love the most about this book, is that the main characters are not the people that you expect them to be, and when you are getting things from their point of view it is all the more arresting because of that. The other thing that I really love about this one, and that I just can't quite get out of my head, is that society itself created this problem, and the way that Rosamund Lupton spoons that to you. There's commentary in this about immigration, there's commentary in this about race, about discrimination, about what it actually means to be inclusive. This is the only one on this list that I would trigger warn for specifically. I mean, fundamentally it's a book about a school shooting, so obviously there is that as a trigger warning. If that is something that has affected you or is sensitive to you, then I would avoid it. So if you don't mind that and you like emotional devastation, then this one is for you. Alright, so now for that author that everybody was expecting to be on this list, and I doubt that you expected her to be this far down on the list, did you? The author that I'm talking about is of course Lisa Jewell. Now, I got into Lisa Jewell's books at some point last year or the year before, and I have been steadily working my way through her backlist ever since. And in all that time, I have only met one Lisa Jewell book that I absolutely hated, and anybody else that I've started on her books has come back to me and been like, oh my god, so I read this one and I loved this one. It's a fun club that we all now belong in, the Lisa Jewell fan club. But I genuinely had quite a problem with deciding which book was going to end up on this list, because I've talked a lot about two in particular, but this year, in fact just last month, she brought out another one which I have read, which is None of This Is True, which was so spectacular and so different, so like nothing I have read before, that it almost made this list. But most of the books on this list have been on this list for a while. They have endured, and so I don't want to put anything on my top 10 that maybe in a couple of months I'm going to be like, oh that was amazing, but it hasn't really stuck with me. Everything that's here is a book that's like stalked me, that I have repeatedly talked about over months or years. And so of course the book that I ended up with on this list is The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell. If you've been around my channel for more than 5 minutes, then you have definitely heard me talking about this one, and you have definitely heard me tell you the synopsis for it. So this one is also about Libby. I genuinely had to look that up because I was like, surely it isn't, but it actually is. I didn't make it up. That's actually her name. There are 2 Libbys on this list. And Libby is living a quiet and very innocuous kind of life. She is adopted, her parents are unremarkable, her background is unremarkable, she works for a place that sells bathrooms, and really she's just kind of timing her life by an exact timeline that she imagined in her head that was promised to her as like a white middle class child. She's expecting to meet a guy and then get engaged and then get married and then have a house and then have a baby. And so when a letter arrives on her desk which tells her that she has mysteriously inherited a beautiful and extremely expensive house in London, she can't believe it because she's just plain old Libby. However, as the lawyer explains to her the circumstances of this inheritance, she realises that she was actually the baby in a massive crime case all those years ago. She was found in her bassinet alone, completely well cared for, not even a dirty nappy in sight. And yet 2 floors down there were 3 rotting corpses who had supposedly died in a cult suicide pact. So when Libby goes back to the house, she is creeped out and doesn't know what to do about it. And there she meets a journalist, and that journalist, it turns out, got his very first scoop by covering this case, and he knows a lot more about Libby's background than she does. And so they kind of team up to try and work out what actually happened in this house, where she actually came from. And there are 2 other mysterious POVs that are hanging about in the background here. We hear from 2 other characters who aren't named until quite far into the book. Honestly, I read this so fast and I fell in love with the characters so fast, and that's one of the things that I love about Lisa Joy that's consistent through almost all of her books, is that her characters are so relatable. She describes them herself as quirky. I wouldn't say that they're quirky. I feel like most of them are just like average people, but who are again thrust into these situations that they don't expect to find themselves in, and the way that they thrive is interesting. I think she writes really interesting, really relatable characters, and again characters who the minute that they walk on the page I believe that they're fully formed, and I believe that they've had all of these thoughts. I did not know what was going to happen in the end of this one, and it ends in a way that there are still questions, which is partially why I hate that there's a sequel. So there is a sequel, The Family Remains, for this one, and I would conservatively advise you not to read it. If you loved the first one, I just say don't bother with the second one. There is actually another book on this list that I say the same about, but with a much bigger warning on this one. Like, the characters don't feel like themselves. They feel like a very reduced version of what she did before, a very less complex version of what she did before. So I would say skip the sequel, but this one is pretty immaculate. Now, the next two books on this list, I had a bit of a battle about for which one was going to be at number 3 and which one was going to be at number 2. There's almost nothing in it, and so I just had to arbitrarily decide. It's why making... I missed it again! It's why making these lists is just so stressful, because I'm like, but that's not the perfect place. But in the end, I just had to really split hairs, and so the book that is in at number 3 is a thriller that I just don't hear anybody talking about, and I don't understand why, because everybody I've recommended this to has been blown away by it. So the reason that I decided to split hairs and put this one where it is because this is actually the first in a series, and very much like The Family Upstairs, I don't really think it needed to be a series, but Rachel Caine was a writer who wrote series. That was what she did. She wrote books with the same character over and over again, and so I think the concept of doing a standalone was a bit alien to her. And so we ended up with 5 books, I think, in the end. I stopped at book 4, but unlike The Family Remains, where I'm like, just skip it entirely, I do think that the follow-up to Still House Lake is actually worth reading, and the third book isn't bad. It just goes in a direction that I don't want it to go in. So this one is about Gina. At the beginning of this book, she is driving her 2 teenagers back to the house. She comes round her corner and there are emergency vehicles all over her road, and she realises, oh my god, it's actually happened. Car has taken this horrendous turn. The thing that we were worried about for forever has finally happened. A car has taken this horrible turn into our road too fast, and they've gone straight into our house. And that is indeed what has happened. So she stops the car, and a police officer comes over to her, and she's like, oh god, this is my house, is everybody okay? And she's immediately arrested. She has no freaking idea what's going on until she discovers that when that car went into the side of her house, it went into her garage, and in that garage, which she was never ever permitted to go into, that was only her husband's space, there was the hanging body of a woman, and she was the 4th or 5th victim of a serial killer who turns out to be Gina's husband. We then flash forward to a few years later, and we are now following Gina, who is now Gwen, because she is in witness protection with her children and she has an entirely new identity. But witness protection when you have a serial killer for an ex-husband is not as straightforward as it could be, because there are people on the dark web who are determined to find her. She has been moved several times by this point, and she now lives in Still House Lake, which is a very, very small community of cabins in a very, very small town on Still House Lake. And then one morning on Still House Lake, a body washes up in front of her house. And it turns out that this person has been killed in the exact same style as her husband's murders. This is, for me, an immaculate book. I have no complaints. I have no notes. There is nothing that this could have done better. The pace is breakneck, but yet also you get time to spend with the characters, so much so that once again the kids in this have really stuck with me. It's impossible to tell you anything else about where this one goes without giving spoilers, because there are so many little things, there are so many little breadcrumbs and so many little reveals. It just blew my mind, it boggled me. And honestly, this has got like a 4.12 rating over like 150,000 reviews on Goodreads, and it absolutely deserves it. It's just so... Some of the reveals in it just made me feel so like, oh. And there were some suspenseful scenes where something was actively about to happen to a character where I was like, this cannot happen. Like, this unequivocally cannot happen. And yeah, I mean, I literally, I have no improvements. Nothing else could be done to this book to make it better. Even the cover lives in my head rent-free. It's just... it's perfect. Which might then lead you to ask, if that one was perfect, then how can something be better than it? How can there be anything better on this list? But there are 2 books still to go, guys. So coming in at number 2 is actually an author that I've broken up with. Like, it was sad, it was messy, and it was traumatic, and I don't want to think about it. But that author is Karen Slaughter. However, there are 2 Karen Slaughter books which are basically perfection, but one of them, which for me is a book that it's just never gone away. I think about it every other day. You asked me just off the cuff, like with no preamble, no time to prepare, what my top 3 thrillers were, it would always be in there. And I will say before we go any further in, it is another book about a school shooting, so in that sense it's not entirely unique on this list, whereas all of the other books have done very different things from each other. But I will also say that when I was reading this book, it wasn't for me about the shooting or about the thing that had happened. It was about the characters that this whole thing revolved around. So The Good Daughter is about Charlotte and Samantha Quinn. They are sisters and they are pretty much estranged. They grew up in a very small town with a father who was a lawyer, and he took on cases where the defendant couldn't afford to defend themselves, or there was nobody available who wanted to take such like a piddly case. But one night at the very beginning of this book, something truly horrendously horrible happens to their family home and to their mum. We're now 28 years later. Both Samantha and Charlotte have gone on to become lawyers, although they are very different kind of lawyers. One of them has stayed in their tiny town and works for their dad, and the other one has gone to the big city and is now a big corporate lawyer. And then one day Charlotte calls her sister Sam in that shiny suit job and says, "You need to come home." This is another book which is so incredibly packed full of twists and turns. Things happen that I just defy you to see coming, and that's one of the things that I love so much about Karen Slaughter's writing, and why I'm so sad that I'm not going to be reading any more of her books, because the twists in her books don't feel like twists, they feel like horrible inevitable things that you should have seen all along, which is how things feel in real life a lot of the time. But she just writes the most complex, the most detailed, the most thoughtful and thorough sister relationships ever, and I'm always just so carried away with watching these 2 very different women try to find a common ground, try to find a way to love each other despite their differences and despite everything that's gone on and despite everything that's still going on. And not only are they very different people, but they have very different views on what's happening, and they don't really know how they're going to negotiate the circumstances that they find themselves in, but they have to. They don't have a choice. And that's why I say that for me the school shooting aspect of this one is very much a secondary thing, although you are definitely investigating that case, and that case is sort of the backbone of the book, and those characters are interesting. These sisters are where it's at for me, and watching them bounce off each other again and again while trying to find a soft spot to lean on each other is just so heartbreaking. Such a good freaking book. Again, I am so salty. I'm just so salty that this is not the book which Karen Slaughter decided to give a sequel, because I would honestly, I would do bad things for a sequel to this. That's probably a recommendation for you. And then finally, the book that is at my number 1 slot, that's the top of this list. There is one big notable exception author for me here. one author who I'm sure that a few of you have already worked out isn't here and are surprised, and a few of the rest of you are like, oh, who is that? I thought she said all of her favourites. Or if you're new here, it's going to be a nice and pleasant surprise, because this thriller is my favourite thriller of all time. Like, hands down, no other thriller's going to touch it. They shouldn't try. I don't very often have an answer if I'm asked like on the spot what's your favourite book of all time, because my answer to that is usually like in what genre. But for thrillers, this is my favourite book. And that book is The Lost Man by Jane Harper. Yes, a few of you have worked it out now and now you're kicking yourself, because Jane Harper is one of my favourite authors. I've read everything that she has written except for the last book in the Aaron Falk series, because of course I haven't. But we are going to be reading that as a series read along for my Patreon, which starts in October. So if you are interested in reading that series through, then now is a good time to join. I'm going to have a monthly live show after every book to see what everybody thought about it. I'm very excited to get back to that world. But anyway, yes, in the meantime, The Lost Man. So Jane Harper is an Australian author and all of her books are set in Australia, and I maintain that there is a certain tone in Australian fiction that just works so well for me. I don't think I've ever picked up a book that was written by an Australian author that I haven't absolutely loved. I think sometimes you just get the sense of a place from an author, and that is something that Jane Harper does so very well. Like, I talk a lot about the idea of place as character. It's one of my favourite things in books. If you can make me love a place and have that place have as much personality as the characters who are in it, then I am sold. I am there. I will follow you to the ends of the earth. So weirdly, I find it quite difficult to pin down exactly what this thriller is about, because it's about so many different things. It's set in Queensland on two massive cattle farms, and it's really primarily about two brothers, and they're not the best brothers to each other, and in fact their family is fractured and broken in a few places. But out in the middle of nowhere like this, where it literally is an airplane ride to a hospital and where it is 2 or 3 days drive to a small city, you have no choice but to look out for each other. And so when Cameron's family put up a distress call to say that he is missing, his brother immediately runs to his aid. But what he finds is Cameron's Jeep, air conditioning still working, fully stocked with water and food. And really, if anything happened out there that far away from anything, you stay in your car. And Cameron wasn't in his car. In fact, the doors of his car were wide open and there were footprints leading away. And when he eventually finds his brother, he has curled up completely naked on the grave of an old stockman, and Cameron has seemingly just walked out into the heat and outback to die. These spider webs in this, the web of affinity between characters, where one crosses over and then somebody else's story touches that and then you're off to somewhere else. There are so many different threads to this, but it never feels like overwhelming amounts of information. It feels like one of those books where you just organically know things. Like, you get 100 pages in and you're like, oh my god, I've come so far. So many things have happened. How could I even quantify this in telling somebody about this book? And it blew my mind. This book blows my mind. I want to just read it over and over again every month. It will not get old. And again, all of the thrillers on this list I would quite happily read again. And I think that's the mark of a good thriller. Like, if you know the twist but you want to actively read it again, that's the mark of a good thriller. Because you want to read it again to see all the stuff that you missed. You want to read it again because you want to see those characters with different eyes. You want to read it again because the twist was so good, you want to get that feeling back. I want to give copies of this to everybody free. If I had enough money, I would do that. I would give a copy of this to everybody that I meet. So that is it, guys. That is the end of my top 10 thrillers, although hopefully it's not the end of me collecting top 10 thrillers. Hopefully these are not the only thrillers that I'm ever going to love. I'm still reading them, I'm just not reading as many of them, and I'm reading them a lot slower. So if you have got this far through the video, then please leave me the little trophy emoji down below, like the little prize winning cup for this being my top 10. And if you have read any of the books on this list and have also loved them, then please tell me about that below. Or if you have any thrillers, the best thrillers that you have ever read that you would like to recommend to me so that I can find more 5-star thrillers, then please leave them down below. Don't forget to check check out Brilliant, my link is down below in the description box. If you are new here and you would like to see more top 10 lists from me in the future, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you have enjoyed this video, then please hit that thumbs up because it really does help my channel. And I'll speak to you soon, guys. Bye!